Hello, and welcome to the Proactive Caregiving Podcast. As a CPA with over 20 years as an industry accountant, Jessica stepped away from the corporate world to become a full-time caregiver for her mother. Having learned invaluable lessons along the way, she is now here to share those with you and to invite you to join her on this caregiver's journey. Here is your host, Jessica Cannon.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I am the Proactive Caregiver, and I specialize in educating others on how to be a proactive caregiver by empowering you, the caregiver. If you can't take care of yourself, then you can't take care of your loved one. It's just that simple. So today I wanted to go a bit deeper into what dementia is and how our loved ones are diagnosed. Just like the late Maya Angelou said, we do better when we know better. I too was able to do much better by Mom and reduce my own level of stress from the unknown the more I learned. There are two things that made the biggest difference for me. One, understanding our anatomy, being the heart and gut in connection to the brain. And the second, understanding the stages of dementia, regardless of the type. But before I get into those details, please keep in mind this is strictly based on my personal experience caring for Mom, who lives with mixed dementia, and not at all intended to be medical advice or replacement for seeking care for your loved one, or even yourself. So have you been in a conversation with people? I've been finding myself more in this type of conversation lately, where you start to talk about your loved one. You start to share the chaos, the emotions, the exhaustion, the fear. And there's sometimes that response from them saying, oh, my loved one doesn't have dementia. They have Alzheimer's. Well, this response is typical now because although dementia has been around for well over a century, it hasn't been given the due process that it's getting now. Alzheimer's is dementia. It just happens to be the most well-known form of the top 4 out of well over 100 different types. So what is dementia? That was really hard for me to understand. Just going off of Mom's behaviors, her responses, mood swings. But part of this was hard for me and for our family because long before we ever looked into what dementia is, Mom was living with bipolar manic depression. Bipolar manic depression is a mental health condition. And it causes extreme mood swings that include emotional highs and lows. You may have heard them referred to as mania or hypomania, or lows that get into depression, severe depression, suicidal thoughts. This was difficult for us because we didn't understand what Mom was going through. The only thing we had to look at were her mood swings, and eventually they fluctuated between the episodes of depression that went beyond feeling sad, which is normal. We all have the moody blues. We all have moments of sadness. Life happens. Relationships, work, job, bosses, our children even. Life just happens and we have these moody blues. But Mom's moody blues went beyond the typical moody blue. She's got to the point of showing hopelessness and even suicidal thoughts, writing letters of goodbye. Not that she would ever take her life or to my knowledge, has ever attempted to. I guess the one saving grace for us was she lived a life of a devout Catholic. But for all those who don't, you get into these cycles that they begin and this high and low cycle, and it's hard to understand them. It's hard to be around that. And these cycles would get to a point where she just eventually lost interest in things that really gave her pleasure throughout her life, like building flower beds and building extravagant, detailed doll houses. And I'm talking like lining these doll houses with electricity and furniture and every minute detail down to the dinnerware setting in the dining room. Just top to bottom, extravagant detail. And then she would drop into these episodes of the total opposite spectrum from the depression into these euphoric, high energy, real irritable. So it's hard to look at those moody blues and say, oh, she's just having a bad day, or she's just a little off. The problem with these episodes are not only those around you and for us growing up with her, was we become emotionally challenged to understand and cope with what's actually happening. Your loved one is also challenged with trying to understand what is happening. They probably are not even considering that something's off. They just are. They're experiencing sleep problems, insomnia, for example. And that insomnia sometimes it just comes, as I knew, mom was just from those highs and lows. When she had those highs, she was just so energetically charged or too irritable from the lack of sleep. That led into the lack of energy, resulting in excessive sleep, which again, between not enough sleep or too much sleep, it began to show signs of bad judgment. These behaviors just kept going and going. And it was really hard to understand. In her reaction, of course, maybe her tolerance or her patience was wearing thin with us as we grew older, especially as we went through our adolescence and young adult. So imagine driving around town with this explosive road rage, or this thought in your mind that won't go away of wanting to die. These extreme mood swings that we learned to grow up around her taught us not to look at what was happening and why, but only a defensive mechanism of when and how to avoid her, unfortunately. And even though medication could be prescribed, things to help her with her mood swings, with her depression, antidepressants, she finally just would get to that point of, I feel good. The medication, I'm normal. So it's working maybe. But unfortunately, sometimes she would also get to that point saying, I feel great. I'm normal. I don't need the medication. And so she would quit the medication cold turkey, starting the cycle all over again. I think she also had that stigma that society often does when people are going through things like this. If you don't understand what's happening, then it's easy to just look at it and think, on the outside looking in, thinking, oh, that person's just crazy. And it's hard to get away from that stigma, and it's hard to avoid it. But I think at some point she became quite the actress and learned how to hide the differences. Sometimes she could smile and hide behind the smile. Other times it was just she was so tired. She needed to take a nap. She just needed some rest. And that gave her time alone so that she didn't have to put on that persona of everything's fine. But during the years, as we got older, became adults, having children of our own, we were able to pay closer attention and started noticing more erratic behaviors. And now looking back, I can see that the moments that she was living through, these extreme highs and lows, and more often than not, the lows, the depression, it was actually masking the early signs of dementia, the early stages. And since we didn't know any better back then, we just continued on with the same way of life of how to avoid her or dismiss her as a crazy hormonal woman. But that's so unfair. It's so unfair to our loved ones and others who are living with this in society. Because when we look back at it, the luxury of knowledge we have now wasn't available to us back then. And there were so many moments that we could have stepped in to make definite changes, positive changes, and we just learned to exist. So let's go back to that question. What is dementia? Dementia is something that people to this day, doctors, so many studies being done, are still trying to wrap their brain around, pun intended, trying to understand what is this, what causes it. I find that what I have learned, there is this question of, is dementia a disease or is it just deterioration? But when you look at the symptoms, the causes, as I did, I understood that dementia is more of a progression. It's a progression at the loss of brain cells, resulting in a decline from day-to-day cognition and function. So back in our years of avoiding mom and just trying to learn how to be around her and understand the differences of her mood swings or what may have triggered them to begin with, there was also this consideration of delirium. So we think about what is the difference between dementia and what is the difference between delirium. Because there are some similar symptoms, similar things for us to consider. Delirium is something that's more of a sudden onset of a mental confusion. Usually it comes from the result of a medical or environmental condition. This is something that you can consider if you've gone in for a procedure or if your loved one may have gone in for a procedure. Perhaps they had something, an outpatient procedure or something that maybe they had to stay in the hospital a little while longer. And a lot of times when you're having those procedures, you're going to be prescribed medication, pain meds, or other things that would go along with it. As your body's trying to heal from the procedures, then you would actually have this moment, this delirium that would be more so temporary. And when you're in this moment of delirium, your loved one may be, you or your loved one maybe have difficulty at that point in time to understand what's happening, or as far as being able to stay focused or be able to pay attention. But with dementia, they are perfectly capable of staying focused throughout the day. And they're perfectly capable of managing and going about their day, which is why it makes it really difficult when you see one moment to the next, something odd happens, and we just kind of chalk it off to that particular moment, that point in time, as it was just something odd. And it takes a while before these odd moments start to happen a little bit more frequently before they start to add up and you start noticing, this odd thing is happening a little bit more often. You start to notice how your loved one is becoming a little bit more distracted, maybe a little bit more withdrawn than normal. Their mental status seems to fluctuate a little bit more often. They seem to be struggling with communication, not as much as they used to, but now it seems like it's more of a challenge. They're not reading or writing as much because it also is somewhat of a challenge. Between the delirium and the depression from dementia, and the dementia in itself entirely both suffer from memory loss. And that's why people look at this as, oh, it might be Alzheimer's, because they're connecting memory loss with just Alzheimer's. So let's go back. If dementia is the loss of brain cells over this period of time, then can we understand if this is reversible or irreversible? Well, depending on the type or the severity of the symptoms or what's happening at that moment, it can be reversible. And I know this sounds odd, especially if you've been around many people who have Alzheimer's. But think about it. A reversible type of dementia is something that is more so temporary, something that is caused by a brain tumor, something that might be removed. Depression, which is actually possible to be treated. Dehydration. Surgery of all kinds. Metabolic disorders such as disease from thyroid, pancreas, liver, or kidneys. The side effects to medication, infections like urinary tract infections, circulatory disorders, nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, substance abuse, head trauma, carbon monoxide poisoning, Lyme disease, sleep disorders, simple and normal pressures, which that is something that I wasn't aware of either until I dug further. The normal pressure, or NPH, which is an abnormal buildup of cerebral fluid in the brain's ventricles or cavities. Stuff like that. Things that can occur, have a reason why they're occurring, a very specific reason why they're occurring, can be handled. There's medical ways, there's non-medical ways. But when you look at areas that are like the 4 top types of dementia, these are irreversible. And unfortunately, it is going to be your Alzheimer's, Lewy body, vascular dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. I don't know if you've ever heard of Pick's disease, Huntington's, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which is also known as mad cow disease. Those are going to be the ones that are irreversible. So in thinking about that, I'm sure, like I did, that question comes up. Am I genetically predisposed? This is one of the things that stressed me quite often the more I learned about Mom and the forms of dementia she was living with. The panic and stress set in for me. Could this happen to me? Would this be my story someday? I caution those who would dismiss these genetics as whether or not they might have the gene, or dismiss it thinking I don't have to worry about dementia because I don't carry that gene. But even though researchers now know that there are 10 different genes believed to be associated with Alzheimer's, and there are blood tests that you can take to determine if you carry them or not, they don't provide a definitive diagnosis. Having genes only increases your risk. It doesn't mean you have it. These genes may very well remain dormant throughout our life, just by the choice of lifestyle changes. So some of the risk factors for dementia. Aside of any genetic history, you might experience a head trauma, such as a concussion, or multiple head injuries that are also considerate of TIAs, which are called transient ischemic attack, mini strokes basically. Lifestyle factors such as smoking, excessive alcohol, unhealthy diet, and physical inactivity. These are things that are irrelevant to whether or not you carry the gene or not, but definitely are the risk factors of turning those genes on. And then there are the other places in life that, considering the risk factors that are there, some of those risk factors actually cause cancer. And so people might think they don't need to worry about dementia because they don't have dementia, they have cancer. And if that is in your genetic history, then it is possible that cancer treatment, such as chemotherapy, can expose you to a form of dementia. Whether it's surgery to the brain or the removal of some form of cancer, the chemo itself that causes the injury to the brain, it's unknown if that actually creates the dementia, because studies are still in process of determining patients' mental health before and after treatment. But they are starting to see more prevalence of dementia post-chemotherapy. So Mom never smoked. She rarely indulged in alcohol. She did love her Choco Vine wine whenever she was able to have it. But medications, you can't drink with your medication. She certainly couldn't. She didn't grow up with a healthy diet any more than she grew up with a positive example of what physical activity is. So as she grew and aged through her 20s and 30s and 40s, this all just compounded. And her lifestyle at that time just made things worse. She would tell me several times, "It's not what you're eating, it's what's eating at you." But yet, we never understood what was eating at her until it was too late. The dementia was masked by her manic depressive bipolar disorder. The depression masked the early signs of dementia. The denial, even when she was considering something was not right, the denial there. And I get it. I can remember when I was in my senior year of high school, sitting in class, talking with some of the other students, ironically saying, when I start growing old and I start having gray hairs, I'm going to grow old gracefully. Yeah, you could say I was a little naive back then, because the first time I saw a gray hair on my head in my mid-30s, I plucked it. Don't worry, I know you're not supposed to do that, and I stopped doing that, especially when I heard the wives' tales of everyone you pluck, 10 more will grow. It's quite the opposite, so I stopped plucking any gray hairs that popped up. But I started buying the boxes to dye my hair. I was definitely in denial. I was aging. The signs were starting to show. And if I was aging and these were the physical, visible signs, then does that mean I will age into the way Mom was living? Yes, denial was definitely there. But the knowledge of how to live differently than she did, I don't want to say better. Because I do know that we learn as we grow. We learn indirectly from our parents, from our peers in school, and it creates our lifestyle before we even know what we have created until we start having problems. Things that get us into that emergency room, or things that get us into the doctor's office, things that start building up the prescription list of what we have to take to live day by day. Dementia is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States alone. So when you think about memory and dementia, I know many people are quick to jump to, that's just Alzheimer's, or dementia is only the loss of memory. But it's far more than that, because as the brain deteriorates, and depending on the place it's deteriorating in your brain, that will determine your type. And across many of the types, there is a loss of language, a loss of judgment, a loss of spatial and visual abilities, and eventually the loss of memory. We think about our past and present experiences of life. That loss of memory also includes the brain forgetting how to tell the body how to function properly. So it's not just a loss of memory. Diagnosis is something that it takes, once the denial is set aside between you and your loved ones, and it is approached in an open manner, not defensively. Diagnosis is the next step to take. That is something that it takes a lot of time, but doctors will step you forward in helping to test. Going to a neurologist to start, if you've already gone to a general doctor and mentioned the things that are happening, the weird things, the abnormal things, or the progression of something that to others on the outside would seem normal, but when things pile up, they're not so normal. So the testing starts, and there's a complete background history of their previous medical procedures. They're even down to the point of emotional stability or any unusual occurrences. They're trying to pinpoint your behaviors or their behaviors and responses that are connected to different types. And then they start going through this first round of series of blood tests, getting a PET scan or an MRI scan. And if you're like my mother, who has a defibrillator, then they're limited to the PET scan and or the CAT scans. They check the cognitive functioning. They check for the attention. They check for the initiation, the preservation. They check for the construction of the brain, conceptualizing, and they check their level of memory, their recall, the ability to recall. And then you go through a second round, determining on a geriatric depression scale, and sometimes not geriatric. They go through this anxiety inventory, pre-morbid function testing, the independent living scale, a behavior rating inventory or executive function testing, instrumental activities of daily living, the memory and malingering, and so many more tests. It gets to be very lengthy. And I know it may be difficult for your loved one to sit through, because I know at times Mom had one of her rounds of testing, she was required to fast, and it was early morning. And it was long hours. The first thing she said when she got out of there, she realized she deserved a dessert for having to sit through all of that. The reward system in the brain was still working. It's just that when we go through these changes and we are quick to dismiss, whether we are in denial or we're scared, which is rightfully so, our bodies are changing, our loved ones are changing in ways that we would have never anticipated. I know I never wanted to see Mom the way she lives now, but we found ways to adapt and accept. Our early indicator was the abundance of denial, and we overlooked her depression for anything more than what it was. Denial came from all of us not wanting to grasp the gravity of this reality. Depression led to avoidance of the facts at hand, and along with each other, we avoided each other. We were unable to communicate honestly and openly because we had no idea what was happening, and the truth was scary. Still is scary. But once I began to take that peek behind the veil of the unknown it started to make more sense. Mom was not crazy after all. Mom was doing the best she could to survive a deteriorating brain. I encourage you to look behind your loved one's veil and begin testing for dementia sooner than later if you suspect it. Don't be afraid. You're not alone. I hope this gave you more food for thought. And until next time, be proactive. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about proactive caregiving and to hear other episodes of this podcast, please visit www.jessicalizelcannon.com. This podcast is produced by Cannon Light Media, LLC, www.cannonlightmedia.com. Music provided by Chris Paradise.